Hello everyone, I'm Thomas Hahn. I work at Stockholm Resilience Center as a researcher. I'm an associate professor in environmental social science and ecological economics. And thank you for inviting me to this summer school. I will talk on this subject on resilience. And let's see how this works. I will start with some ontology of what is socio-economic systems, and then talk about World Economic Forum and the problems we have and how we must adapt economics to these problems. And then about resilience as a normative concept. It's not very easy to discuss what is desirable. And then adaptations and transformations, which at sector levels are needed for biosphere resilience at planetary scale. Okay. So my first picture here is that sustainable development cannot be reduced to the 3 pillars, which is very common in the European Union to use these. Because sustainable development is about social and ecological resilience and sustainability. Economic activities are important, like these things, but they all depend on well-functioning social systems. And if these social systems do not work, all these things, politics, governance, institutions, social capital, then we will not have a good economic system. And these systems are in turn subsystem of the biosphere. And if these things don't work, if our ecological functions and the ecosystem services do not deliver, then there will be no peace and no prosperity in the social and economic system. So this is some kind of the ontology that we work with in ecological economics. And also it's important to show some difference here, that ecological economics, we view that human well-being depends on the biosphere, regardless whether we understand it or not. It's a quite harsh statement, and because in standard neoclassical economics, we say that the value of nature depends on human preferences, because only humans can assign values to things. So of course, nature has an aspect of nature does not have a value unless there are some human beings who claim the value. I think both of these statements are reasonable, but I think if we acknowledge that we have lack of knowledge, we acknowledge genuine uncertainty, then we understand that the ecological economics has a point here. Okay, I want to give you some overview. Maybe you've seen this before, but the World Economic Forum, when they make this global risk every year, they define the worst risks in terms of impact and likelihoods as these up in the right corner. If you look at them, you find that 6 of 8 of the worst risks are ecosystem based. This means, unlike when I was a student, you had to actually convince decision makers about the problems. We no longer have to convince them about the problems, only about the solutions. It is quite significant to think about these things actually, because we have moved from the neoliberal era, when the worst things people thought about in the global elite was asset price collapse and slowing down the Chinese economy, until 2010. So I think 2011 is the beginning of the biosphere era. We see here that after this 2011, the global elite have understood the problems in a different way. And this is the same up to last year. The red stuff down here are actually water crisis, which is also ecosystem based. You all discussed these things of decoupling in this course. I just want to make a short note saying that yes, we have had some absolute decoupling in the European Union for the last 25 years. Well, until 2014, but then there's not been any absolute decoupling. So this is totally insufficient compared to the Paris Agreement. And it shows that we have picked the low-hanging fruits. We have to do much more. But the word decoupling is really bad because it actually reinforces the GDP focus, because we think that the challenge is to continue growing GDP while reducing emissions and reducing natural resource use. And none of these things have been established. We have not managed neither climate change or natural resource use at the global scale. And more scientists say that the problem actually is the root of the problem. The underlying driver is our belief in economic growth as a solution to all problems. So last year there was this fantastic report by IPBES, the global assessment, where they point out that transformation towards sustainability are more likely when we actually focus on these things. Visions of a good life is a better goal than ever increasing GDP. And we need to lower the total consumption and waste to steer away from the current limited paradigm of economic growth. I think this is the first time when we have a global assessment on environment being so clear that the underlying fundamental problem, a driver of the problems, is our obsession with economic growth. And then, of course, decoupling is useless if the good stuff is not actually good, the GDP growth. So instead of GDP growth, we must steer towards other visions of life, a good life quality. I think you've seen this, of course, Kate Raworth's framework of sustainable economic development, where human well-being is the goal, economics provides the tools, and the biosphere is the foundation. So the challenges in economics today is that we have these two goals of sustainable development. The first goal is about human development, is the social goal, life quality. We want a human development above the social foundation. And the second goal for sustainable development is resilient ecosystems, or biosphere and climate, which provides the life-supporting services despite turbulence, which will come more and more in the future. Economics is not a goal. The third pillar does not exist, but economics provides very important tools to achieve life quality within environmental ceilings. But we must not confuse the means with the ends. And I think we still do that at the European Union. We still do that at the SDGs, because most of the sustainable development goals are related to increased prosperity in terms of economic well-being and GDP. The macroeconomic model, according to standard textbooks, is this simple and a more realistic model. If you look at ecological economic perspective, is that we include the voluntary unpaid work, usually by women, by mothers. It's the most important work we have in society, to bring up children to become good citizens. And everything else in society, rule of law, democracy, is also threatened today. And then we have the biosphere, which you can also see as unpaid work. And finally, the thermodynamics. So this is the more realistic picture of the economy that we should study. Unfortunately, the economic textbooks still looks like this, which means that tomorrow's economists do not get adequate training to handle the global risks or even address the real economic issues. And I see here that the textbook in Stockholm still looks like this. It's a book by Paul Krugman. So we have a lot to do to change the teaching in economics. I think it's the same in most European countries. Resilience, I mentioned this before. It is a descriptive term. It means the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize to retain the same functions and structures and identity and feedbacks. So a resilient system is able to maintain itself despite crisis. And it also incorporates the idea of adaptation. How can we adapt our way of doing things so we can stay within the same kind of system or trajectory? It requires adaptation, learning, and self-organization. But sometimes it's not enough to just stay within the same system and adapt. Sometimes we also discuss transformation, which is about deliberately often eroding resilience of the present state or development path. And then some authors think that transformation, because it's somehow the opposite of resilience, then we should not have resilience because resilience is conservative or just mean maintaining the status quo. So we wrote this paper, Nyqvist and I, to these things, and we find that transformation is needed at lower scales and at sector scales like agriculture and fishing and transportation and waste management and energy sector. We need to change all of these things, which means we have to use economic incentives and economic tools and of course legislation to phase out all these unsustainable activities and make them more sustainable and ecological adapted. So this calls for transformation, and this is needed to have resilience at the biosphere scale, at the planetary scale. So we have to think about different scales to understand that transformation is, you can think of transformation in the same framework as you think of resilience. You just have to think about the, here we can see a multi-level thinking. If the first circle here is at the global planetary scale and the second is at mesoscale, and the lower one is at the micro scale, the sector scale. The planetary level will provide some memory to reinforce, to stay within Holocene structures. At the sector scale, there could be some revolt to change at the mesoscale. So to think about these different dimensions of resilience, and that transformations and revolt can be needed at the lower scale. Yes. In order to sustain resilience at the highest planetary scale, agriculture and ecosystem management at lower scales need to be transformed. I also mentioned here, in the face of corona pandemic and other crises, the question is, do we want resilient socio-economic systems, as my title was, or do we want to transform our systems? And who are we? I was thinking to have a beehive with you now, but it doesn't really work. I asked the first question, how can we define a desirable ecosystem? I think it's quite evident that from an anthropocentric point of view, these are sustained production of valuable ecosystem services. Then, of course, we can discuss what are the valuable services and how the trade-offs and so on. But that's at least the desirable ecosystem. But who decides what is desirable? Well, you can't decide that just because you're a researcher and expert on ecosystem services and ecologist or whatever. So we have to rely on policy documents, for example, the Paris Agreement when it comes to climate, Baltic Sea Action Plan when it comes to the Baltic Sea, etc. So we have to refer to these. We cannot make general statements what is desirable or not. Should governance be resilient? Sorry. Should governance be resilient? I sometimes hear resilient governance and so on. I think it's really a misuse of concepts. Resilience is a good concept to describe many things, but it's absolutely not a good concept to discuss governance, because governance should not be resilient. We want governance to be flexible, transparent, democratic, legitimate, and accountable. A resilient governance can be interpreted as a governance system that persists even when it's obsolete. Of course, we don't want that. So please don't use resilience in the context of governance. Here's a quite common picture showing at the upper left. We have a system with good, that is valuable things. Could be coral dominance or clear water or grasslands. Then there is some slow variables. For the coral reef, it could be overfishing or eutrophication. And this is the real cause, the cause of the shift. But then there is a fast variable, the disturbance, which actually causes the regime shift. It could be a hurricane or some other disturbance. And then the system has changed towards algal dominance. Of course, we can say that the coral dominance was more valuable, desirable, and the algal dominance is less valuable and therefore undesirable. But I think we should be careful with these words, because you can only use these words if you have a real normative context. For example, a policy context, like the Baltic Sea Action Plan, or another context like a research context or the CBD. Because if the shift is undesirable to society, why does it happen? Is it lack of knowledge? I don't think so. I think scientists have had the knowledge for the last 50 years and still trying to inform society, but here's the risk. If you continue with overfishing in Europe and elsewhere, if you continue with agriculture, industrial agriculture, these things will happen with some certainty. And politicians have decided in good democratic order that we want this, we want cheap food. We think that we get cheap food if we have this present kind of fishing and agriculture and forestry and cheap products in our shops, because our consumers, our citizens want to have cheap stuff to buy. So there's been a trade-off, and we have democratically decided to take all these risks. So my message is here that resilience is not always desirable, and vulnerability for pandemics, climate change, and biodiversity loss are unintended. Yes, I can agree with that. It's unintended. Nobody wants it. But at the same time, it's not unknown consequences of our decisions. We have known this for decades. And for example, the industrial agriculture increased vulnerability to all these crises. We know this. There have been so many reports all through my life and even before that. And of course, one problem is that we are short-sighted somehow in our societies. We have limited cognitive capacity, and cost and benefits are unequally distributed. So there are also reasons for lobbyists to want this risky development, because they make the profits. But beside these material consequences of risk on cost and benefits, people also have different ideas of desirable futures. So our political ideas, our ideologies that count. So therefore, when we ask, is social resilience or socio-economic resilience desirable? We must ask for whom, and depends on if we are in the desirable domain or trajectory. And today, I think most environmental researchers say that we are not in the desirable domain or trajectory. We are still in the wrong direction. And who decides this in the democratic society? Well, researchers just have the same kind of voting power as anybody else. So we just have to do our job better to inform and convince more people with our knowledge. But we should not use resilience as a normative concept. It doesn't really work. What about adaptive and transformative capacity? Is that always desirable? That's a good question. It also depends on our values, because adaptations and transformations, I think they should be ecologically and ethically informed. So if we propose some different policies and strategies that are informed by ecological knowledge and are ethically okay, they are based somehow on human rights, then these adaptations and transformations are good, they're desirable in my view. But that's only my view, and that's a political view. that I think it's important to have ecologically sound and ethically informed policies. But hey, there are other people out there who want other kind of transformations. And we see them now in Poland and in Hungary, in governments, and they are quickly transforming their societies and their democracies towards something else, which they think are desirable. So we should be careful when we discuss these very strong value-laden words like resilience and adaptations and transformation. We should not take for granted that other people mean the same things as we mean. My final words. We all want a Holocene-like biosphere system. Holocene is the previous era. Now we are in the Anthropocene, many people claim. But here I say we all want, well, I think we all prefer to have the stability that we had for the last 10,000 years. Nobody really wants. It's unintended consequences when we are now out on a shaky road in the Anthropocene. Resilience at planetary scale is desirable. I think everyone can say that it's desirable. And even the people who are polluting our world think it's desirable to have stable climate and so on. But the present economic globalization and GDP focus in most countries, and even in the Sustainable Development Goals at UN level, and the green economy, which we'll talk about more in this course, have a very strong GDP focus. It's not only GDP in SDG number 8, it's actually many other SDGs that assume that GDP is good for development. So this globalization and GDP focus threaten these things that we all think is desirable. So we have a cognitive dilemma here. We know the problems, and we're still heading in the wrong direction. We want resilience, but our global economic system erodes resilience. Therefore, I usually talk about transformation, especially at the social and policy level. We need transformation of the social system and the economic system. Multi-scale analysis is necessary if we want resilient ecosystems and biosphere and no pandemics at the global level. The direct and indirect drivers need to be adapted or even transformed. The direct drivers are agriculture and fishing and mining and all these activities that we do. And the indirect drivers are the legislation and the economic incentives, the cultural beliefs that are actually underlying our activities in our economy and our societies. And we have to rethink this quite drastically. Adaptability can be defined as here I say that we need adaptation sometimes and transformation sometimes. And this is a bit confusion what these things mean, these terms. So adaptation and adaptability can be defined as the capacity of actors to change ecosystem management and thereby avoid what they regard as undesirable regime shifts. So that means somehow staying within the same domain or the same trajectory. And I think it's perfectly okay to say that we want to stay within Holocene-like biosphere system, because that is the only one where human beings can thrive. So we need somehow adaptation in that system. But that means, logically, that we need to transform the sector policies and the sector activities, the way we are handling, the way we meet our needs in energy and transportation and agriculture and so on. So transformability can be defined as a capacity to break path dependency and shift towards a new, different development trajectory, justified by a fundamentally different narrative. And my students often ask me, okay, so what is the difference here, adaptability and transformability? And I say, well, just ask yourself if the new policy that you're calling for, that you discuss or whatever, belongs to a different narrative. That now we want to do things differently. We want to switch over to more sustainable development, which means some different logic in agriculture. Farmers should not only be producers of cheap food, they should be producers of very healthy, nutritious food and other ecosystem services, like like flood protection and good recreation, ecotourism, and so on. So if you see farming changing towards narrative that you actually engage in ecotourism and production of healthy, sustainable food, that is a transformation. All the farmers still produce potatoes and wheat and vegetables and even some cattle. And so the definition of transformation, you can only see that in the social realm, in the how you justify things and how you think about these things. But if it's an adaptation, then you try to keep the same kind of goals. I'm a profit maximizer. I want to produce food in an efficient way. I just do it a little bit more friendly to the environment. I stop these pesticides. That's an adaptation. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you find these concepts somehow useful to think about resilience and adaptability and transformability. Thank you very much. That's all for me today. Maybe we'll meet within a few weeks, unless I'm out sailing. Depends on the schedule of your course. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.